My name is Lynn Vachoni. My husband's name was Lance, and he underwent treatments here for multiple myeloma at UAMS. If we had stayed in Chicago, and I think there's several doctors that have said that he probably would not have made it past December of that year. And for Lance to have lost, if he would have lost his daddy at the age of 4, he would have had some vague memories. But the last 3 years have been extraordinary. You know, the times that even though my husband couldn't go out and play baseball, we could go to the batting cages and Lance could sit in a chair and instruct his son on how to bat. And there's a huge difference between the age of 4 and the age of 7. And those are precious moments. And I think one of the gentlemen, someone had said a lot of legacy moments were built during our time together. And even that last 3 weeks of Lance's life, extraordinary moments where for our son, his memories are, I think, cemented of his father. He had an amazing father of faith, and he remembers seeing his daddy, reading his Bible, and his daddy having faith regardless of how difficult it was. And he wouldn't have been able to fathom and capture that at the age of 4, but he can at the age of 7. I didn't ask for permission. I just said, well, this is what we are going to do. And the fact that doctors and nurses and staff, I tried to stay under radar as much as I could. And I don't think I really even needed to feel that, because very quickly I saw that people recognized and that he was eating breakfast there, and the nurses, I was putting him to bed there. And the fact that Lance could lay down in bed with his dad each night and fall asleep before I moved him over to the couch, where I would make a tent for him every night. And it became an adventure for Lance. And if you talked to him about those last 3 weeks his daddy was alive, he has some funny memories of where the Easter Bunny put the eggs in the hospital room. And he remembers holding on to Rory, his dinosaur, and he'd have his earplugs in, and he would just fall asleep with his daddy. And even I talked about his brushing his teeth. Those were just sweet moments. Lance would literally, this would be, as he'd brush his teeth, he'd stand next to my husband's hospital bed and he'd rub my husband's arm with one hand, and he'd brush his teeth with the other, and they would watch whatever it would be on TV that they would be watching. And they never talked, but it was just, he was soaking up those moments with his father. And I think in some ways maybe our son knew where we were headed, even maybe before I knew where we were going to be headed very quickly. And those are moments that if I could impress upon this hospital or any other hospital, that importance of staff and doctors and nurses looking at us as a family unit versus a patient who needs to be medically tended for. There was emotional needs that both my husband and my son and I needed, and they were met by the staff by allowing us to live out what ended up being our last 3 weeks together as a family unit without us being separated. Those are important moments. It was Saturday morning, and I was getting my son dressed for his baseball game, and had my Padres shirt on because Lance was playing for the Padres. And one of the doctors walked in and happened to notice, she was just doing rounds and happened to notice where we were headed, and she looked at my husband and said, "Would you like to go out and get some fresh air?" And she didn't need to say anything else. And it was just like this unspoken, precious moment of, I knew what she was offering for us to take Lance out. She knew how aggressive the cancer was. She knew even if Lance got out for a week, that probably the next round, we all knew it was a 50-50 chance of whether he'd come out of it or not. And so we got the wheelchair, and we wheeled Lance out of there, and I was the one that wheeled him out of the wheelchair, so no employees could get in trouble. But it was a joint effort of getting Lance comfortable to get us out, and we went to that baseball game. And our son hit a double, and my husband was just so proud. It was just, he was a huge baseball player, he was a huge Cubs fan, and for my son to have his daddy there for one last game, because his daddy had basically missed that entire season, that was an extraordinary moment. And as we wheeled Lance back into the hospital, I had my camera and had my mom, who was in town because this was Mother's Day weekend, and I said, "Mom, take a picture of us." Not knowing that was going to be our last family picture. But when I look at that picture, I don't see tragedy or sadness. What I see is there's almost a knowing smile on my husband's face that just tells his story of what an important moment that was to be able to attend his son's baseball game. There's just something about his smile in that picture and the way he's reaching out and touching both myself and my son. If you look at that picture, there's something incredible about it. And for that doctor to have gone against what probably the rules of the hospital are, that was one of the most extraordinary gifts anyone has ever given to my husband and my son and myself. The nurses over in the infusion center are amazing. The charge nurses, the nurses themselves are amazing, amazing, amazing. What they need to fix is that you have two segments of myeloma patients. You have those that are coming in low risk and they're going through treatments here from day one, and most of them are going to do extremely well. They're going to be here for a few months and be able to go home and go back and forth, and then they're going to return to life sooner than later. And then you have this other segment of patients that are high-risk patients, or patients like my husband that technically until the end was low risk, but his disease acted high risk. And what that means is the treatments need to be much more intensive and the supportive care is much more intensive. And unlike the low risk families, we never really got to go home for months at a time. You know, the first time we were here for 7 months straight, there was no breaks and there couldn't be any breaks. And there's a small, within the large population of myeloma patients, you have this smaller population. I don't know what the percent would be, but probably not more than 10%, but they are requiring much more extensive treatments. And my belief is those patients need to be earmarked, and they have a different set of needs than the other low-risk patients. And I can tell you one of the stories that when Lance was here every single day for 6, 7 days a week, and there was a particular day Lance was in the waiting room for the infusion center and he had an MRI appointment, and he had been waiting for an hour and a half, and the hope had been he'd go in, get his blood drawn, and then be able to go get his MRI and then come back for whatever he needed that day. Well, he went to the MRI. Well, then when he came back, he was waiting another hour and a half. And when I went back to talk to one of the schedulers, I said, Lance has been waiting, and went through the process of what had happened. She said, well, everyone is out there waiting. And this was not one of the nurses, it was a particular scheduler. And I said, I understand that, but for a lot of those patients, they've gotten to go home several times over the last 4 months. My husband has been in constant treatments for the last 2 years. And she was very snippy with me about that. And this was after weeks of my son going to bed crying and being upset because by 7 o'clock at night, his dad wasn't home and his bedtime was 7. So here we have a man that was going to die 6 months later, but was spending an extraordinary amount of time waiting an hour, hour and a half just to get into the back. And I think it's an easy solution. I think it's very easy for the staff to be able to identify these are your high-risk patients and these are the low-risk that have a complicated case, a low risk, that are here. And once they're here for 2 months straight and things are complicated, I think they should wait about 15 minutes in the waiting room, and that's it. And I think what they need to do is to be able to role play with the schedulers and the charge nurses and the front desk people, so that when another patient says, well, I've been waiting for 45 minutes, why did so-and-so to get in earlier? I think if you can give the staff the tools to be able to say, this patient has been in constant treatments for the last 3 months, and while you'll probably be here for 6 weeks and you'll get to go home, that patient is likely still going to be there. And I think if that's said in a very sensitive and compassionate way, I think your typical patient is going to say, oh, okay, I'll wait, I'll understand.